Were you aware of any policies in place that Mr. Preston, as county administrator, had in relation to meetings between county council members and employees of the county?
No.
Before being sworn in January of 2009, did you meet with Mr. Moore and Mr. Dunn about county council business?
Prior to the swearing in?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
How many meetings took place?
I would guess maybe 4 or 5, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Is it possible that you met more than 5 times?
It's possible. I don't recall exactly.
But you recall meeting with a fair amount of regularity.
Yes.
Where did the meetings take place?
They took place over in Bob Waldrop's office.
Did they only take place at Bob Waldrop's office?
Yes, that was the only place.
Did you ever meet at Cindy Wilson's home?
There was a meeting at Cindy Wilson's house, yes.
Were there any other meetings?
You may be telling me because I can't recall if there were. I know they were at Waldrop's office. There was one at Cindy's house.
Let's talk about the meetings at Bob Waldrop's office. When you say his office, do you mean his law office?
His law office, yeah.
And where did you meet in his law office?
In his conference room.
Why did you meet at Mr. Waldrop's office?
Well, he asked us if we'd like to meet at his office, and so we did. To me, going over there was, honestly, it was kind of a training thing because the 3 of us were brand new coming into council. We didn't know the inner workings of how things worked or whatever. Here were some people that were willing to help us get our feet wet, find out how council works, so that's why we had our meetings.
Prior to the primary in June of 2008, do you recall writing that your intention was not to pick sides in the Anderson County political divisiveness?
Did I wrote that?
Yes, sir.
It sounds like something I would say, but I don't recall writing that.
Was that, in fact, your intention?
Not to pick sides? Yeah.
Who attended these meetings at Mr. Waldrop's office?
Was, of course, me, Eddie Moore, Tommy Dunn, Bob Waldrop, his daughter, Liz, his former wife, Nancy, would be there sometimes. Liz and Nancy, off and on. I mentioned Cindy, I think, Cindy Wilson. And there are a couple of other people I'm trying to remember from time to time. Some different people would show up, and I can't even remember now who exactly did show up at those meetings.
Did Tom Beckwith ever attend?
Tom, that's what I was thinking of. I think Tom Beckwith might have been at 1 or 2 of the meetings.
Was Kurt Gibson there?
He did attend, I think, one of the meetings.
Did you all hire Mr. Gibson to provide legal services to you during those meetings?
No.
Was he just there as a citizen?
As a citizen? To my knowledge, yes.
Did Rusty Burns ever attend any of those meetings?
No.
Did Robert Daniel ever attend any of these meetings?
I don't recall if he was at any of those meetings or not.
In addition to those meetings, did you also talk with Mr. Moore on the phone?
Yes.
How frequently did you talk with him on the phone?
It was infrequent. Not that often at all.
Weekly or monthly?
Maybe. This was before the election?
Before January of 2009?
Before January of 2009, maybe a couple times a month, maybe.
In fact, just for clarity of the record, until I specifically tell you that we're going past January of 2009, let's just assume that I'm talking about that for that time period.
Okay.
Did Ron Wilson ever attend any of these meetings?
No.
Was he ever invited?
No, not to my knowledge.
Did you ever invite him?
No.
Did Gracie Floyd ever attend?
No.
Did you ever invite her?
I didn't. No.
To your knowledge, did anyone invite her?
No.
Did you ever consult with Ron Wilson about county politics prior to January of 2009?
No.
Did you ever talk to Gracie Floyd about county business before January of 2009?
No.
Did you ever talk on the phone with Mr. Dunn during this time period?
Yes.
How frequently did you talk to Mr. Dunn?
Probably about the same as Mr. Moore, maybe a little more frequently, like 2 or 3 times a month possibly.
Did you ever speak with Cindy Wilson during this time period on the phone?
I'm sure I probably did, but that was even less frequent.
Did you speak with Mr. Waldrop on the phone during this time period?
Yes.
Before you took office in January of 2009, did the group discuss hiring Bob Daniel?
I don't recall. They could have, but I don't really recall at that time if his name was discussed. They could have been.
Was not Mr. Daniel hired in the very first meeting of the newly elected, including the newly elected county council members?
Very first meeting?
Yes, sir.
I can't remember if it was the first meeting or not.
Did the group discuss forming an ad hoc investigative committee?
We probably did because there were some questions, as to what had happened regarding finances and so on. So there may well have been discussions of doing that.
Was such an ad hoc investigative committee actually formed?
Yes.
Prior to '09, did the group discuss who would serve as the investigative committee chairperson?
No.
Who was the
I was.
committee chairman?
So, I was.
So prior to January of '09, there was no discussion of that you were going to be the chairman of that committee?
No.
Was Ms. Wilson also selected for the committee?
I believe, yes, she was on that committee too.
Did the group discuss changing legal representation prior to January of 2009?
I don't recall that they did. Bob Walter handled a lot of legal side of that. I'm not certain. I can't really answer that question.
Do you have any specific recollection, one way or another, about whether the group discussed the county's legal representation prior to January of 2009?
I don't recall any specifics, but I would say it probably was discussed. But again, I don't recall any specifics.
Did the group talk about Mr. Preston?
Oh yeah, sure, his name came up.
Were the discussions about how to get rid of Mr. Preston?
No.
What were the discussions about?
The discussions primarily centered around a lot of questions as to how are the credit cards being used, what about all these trips that are being taken, who's checking up on the finances. There seemed to be a number of questions about where expenditures were. Those types of things came up, but there was nothing about getting rid of Mr. Preston.
Did you ever hear Cindy Wilson state that the county should fire Mr. Preston?
No, I never recall her using those words.
Did you ever hear anyone say that?
No.
Did you discuss any other county employees during these meetings?
Probably so. Again, I can't recall who it may have been. I'm sure something probably came up about other employees.
Do you have any recollection of another county employee who was discussed?
To be fired, you mean, or just?
Just discussed.
Just discussed in any way. Probably a number of county employees were discussed simply because if you're talking about roads and bridges department, Old Hopkins is going to come up. If you're talking about economic development, Heather Jones's name is going to come up. Purchasing, Robert Carroll's name is going to come up. So yeah, I'm sure other names were brought up and discussed.
Were any employees' names discussed in connection with a potential termination?
There was some discussion, I think, with dissatisfaction with the way jobs had been done. But there was never any terms such as termination or firing used.
What employees were the object of the group's dissatisfaction?
I wouldn't even say it was the group's dissatisfaction.
What employees were the object of some to be determined later person's dissatisfaction?
There were some questions about the way economic development was being run, which was Heather Jones. I think Andy Stringer's name came up, Humphreys. At that time, let me think back. I think Bill Strelling's name came up. He was over Park Police at that time. Let me think. Taylor Jones' name came up. But again, those were primarily, and that was not, I want to be clear on this, it was not the group.
What individuals expressed that concern?
Well, it would be Cindy Wilson and Eddie Moore. And Bob Walter, to some extent, were primarily concerned about the way those offices were being run.
Was that the entire list of individuals that you remember being discussed?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here trying to think if there was anybody else. Of course, let's see. Trying to recall way back who was even there at the time. I think Tom Martin's name might have come up. He was the county attorney. You may have a better list than I do. I can't recall any other names that came up.
Do you recall what law firm Tom Martin worked for?
Yes, I do, McNair.
Is McNair your current law firm?
No.
When was McNair replaced?
Let's see. We took office in January 2009. You may have the specific date because I can't remember. It was somewhere during that first year, but may have been 4 or 5 months into the session. I can't recall, into 2009.
Was McNair replaced with the Nexen Pruitt law firm?
Yeah.
Is Heather Jones still with the county?
No.
Do you recall any dissatisfaction being expressed with respect to the Anderson County Farmers Market?
There was questions about the way the market was being run, yes.
Who was running the market at that time?
It was Brandon Grace.
What were the questions related to the farmers market?
I think it was just basically the way it was being run. There was also, and I'm not even clear where all this comes from, so what I'm about to say is take it with a grain of salt. There was some supposition that he had run some sort of a lottery thing and won a motorcycle trip to South Dakota or something like that, and that it was rigged and he shouldn't have. Anyway, a suit was filed on that, and I don't know I never heard how that finally came out. But whether he won or it was, well, Ms. Wilson was the other one involved with it. If she won or there was an agreement, I don't know what came out of that. I never heard.
In relation to the items that the group discussed in relation to this employee dissatisfaction, did you ever learn of any of those items to be inaccurate?
You can give me something a little more specific than that in regards to certain. If you'll name an individual and tell me I'm not trying to put you on the spot, if you'll name the individual and tell me what it was, I can say if I found it to be inaccurate or not. To make a blanket statement would be difficult to do.
During this time period, certain members of the group were talking about Heather Jones and Angie Stringer and Gina Humphreys and Bill Strewing and Taylor Jones and Brandon Grace at the farmers market and Tom Martin. And what I want to know was, in relation to the items of their dissatisfaction, did you ever learn what they cited to be reason for their concern not to be founded?
Yes.
Can you explain that to me?
Well, I think take Angie Stringer's case. For some reason, there was some dissatisfaction with her. I found Angie Stringer to do a super job. She's a hard worker. She's done a great job. As far as on the Heather Jones side of the house, I don't know since we didn't overlap that much. As far as any allegations or statements made about her, I don't know. I didn't see a whole lot of economic development, but again, I don't know what she might have had going on because she was relieved sometime after by the administrator. So I don't know if any allegations about her were founded or not.
Was Mr. Gibson ever hired by Anderson County?
Yes, he was hired. At this time there were so many lawsuits flying around, it's hard to keep all the players in line. One of the suits, yes, he was defending the council. Myself and me as an individual, and I think Mr. Moore. And that was regarding some emails that were supposedly sent back and forth. But I believe that was the only one Kurt Gibson was involved in.
You were the chairman of the Ad Hoc Investigative Committee?
Uh-huh.
As the chairman, are you still the chairman?
Yeah, that committee's pretty much defunct, but I guess I'm still chairman since it's never been redone or revamped.
Why is the committee defunct?
Well, there's just nothing else to go on. Everything is in court now. Let's go there.
Is the investigation over?
As far as I'm concerned, it is.
And you're the chairman?
Yes. Now, might somebody come along in council and demand that it be reinstituted and revamped because something, I suppose that could happen.
Is that not always a possibility in Anderson County?
It's absolutely always a possibility. People have long memories in Anderson County, I found out.
Talking about long memories, were you aware of prior lawsuits between Mr. Preston and Ms. Wilson?
Yes.
What's your understanding about those lawsuits?
Well, of the ones that I've seen, I think the only thing I can say about it is she failed in most of them. Most of the results that came back were opinions from the Attorney General's office, were basically in Mr. Preston's favor.
Have you ever witnessed anything on the part of Ms. Wilson that caused you to believe that she may be impartial, or not impartial, prejudiced in some way against Mr. Preston?
I think there are numerous things that she certainly disagreed on with Mr. Preston. That's about as far as I could go with it. I know they've had some severe disagreements on various things.
Has Ms. Wilson ever said anything that you considered unprofessional in relation to Mr. Preston?
I would put it this way. Having attended council meetings prior to being elected, even there would be times on council when I felt she would address statements or questions to Mr. Preston that were unprofessional. And of course the council the administrator is the employee of the council. But still, in a setting like that, I thought sometimes the questions were somewhat rough around the edges. Unprofessional, maybe.
Let me mark this as, I think it's Exhibit 3. Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you was, where did this idea that's reflected on page 13 of Exhibit 3, the idea being that there's an audit with an acting administrator and so on, who originated that idea? Do you know?
I believe that was Bob Waltrip that came up with that idea.
And at the very top of the page, do you see where Mr. Waltrip states, and I quote, that I have been speaking with some of the newly elected council people that will be coming on, and they are certainly the elephant in the room, end quote.
Uh-huh.
Were you a newly elected councilperson as of August the 5th of 2008?
No.
You weren't?
Not in 2008. Not in August 2008. We didn't get elected until November.
Your primary was in?
Primary was in June.
You ran unopposed in the general election.
Uh-huh.
So as of June of 2008, you were pretty much elected though, weren't you?
Pretty much, yeah.
So when Mr. Waldrop is referring to the newly elected people here, is he talking about you in part?
I would presume that's who he's talking about. Sure.
Do you recall having discussions about this concept that is reflected on page 13 of Exhibit 3?
Trying to remember, I don't recall specifically how this came out, because what I'm reading here, this was Bob Waldrop's thing, because he had mentioned, about, I think recalled something about when banks get audited, a lot of money, a lot of times they'll move the bank presidents out or something. And this came from him, and he was referring to, in that case, move the administrator out while the audit's being done. That's where he was coming from. We may just vaguely have touched on that, but to tell you the truth, I was pretty much unfamiliar with what this was entailing, so to speak, and Bob was pretty much the one that put this together.
So when Mr. Waldrop says in the next sentence, and I quote, "So I take it from the consensus of what they have said that they would like very much the opportunity to pass on this audit because they're going to be the ones that are going to be responsible to that degree, and that will be greatly appreciated," and goes on to outline several things that he's attributing to you all. That's not correct?
I would say it was. It may have been correct from the standpoint that none of us objected to it. And again, I think a lot of that goes back to the simple standpoint that we're the new guys to this thing. We're a little bit lost here on what's going on, so we didn't raise Cain and object to what he was doing. But I can't say that from that standpoint, that he was totally wrong. But again, a lot of this is items that he put together.
Do you recall discussing the concept of an audit with Mr. Waldrop? I
think we did, yeah. Yeah, we did discuss an audit because, again, a lot of it, the questions that came up about what had been going on in the county revolved around finances and money. There were a lot of, I remember, credit card statements were a big question. As to who had credit cards, how they're being used, where. There were a lot of trips being taken by certain people that were questionable as to why it was being done. So financial audit was certainly a key item.
Is it fair to say that an audit was being discussed as early as July of 2008?
It would appear so, yes.
Were you opposed to an audit?
No.
Did you support one?
I wasn't opposed to it, so I guess I did support it. As a matter of fact, I think going into any new business, I personally would want an audit done.
In this transcript it states, and I quote about halfway down, "An acting administrator would be hired to fulfill the requirements of the South Carolina Home Rule Act, and the acting administrator would fulfill the direction of the county council in this audit exercise, as well as direct the employees of the county," end quote. Do you see that?
That was on page 13?
Yes, sir. It's about halfway down the page.
Okay. An acting administrator would be hired. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Whose idea was that?
That was Bob Waldrop's.
When Mr. Waldrop indicates that you had discussed that, you presumably, Mr. Dunn and Mr. Moore, prior to August 5th of 2008, do you agree with that?
We may have discussed that prior to that date. Trying to remember back that far. The concept of an audit was discussed. As far as the details that are in here, I don't recall those details being discussed prior to this time.
Well, let's just read something here, because I'm confused. And I'll start in the transcript, and I quote, "And I think it would also add to the assurance and trust of the people out there if these new council people have the opportunity to do so." So let me take off a few things here. And then it goes down, and Mr. Waldrop continues, and he says, and I quote, "Since I've got an obligation to do that, and that is that they would like to have a bid procedure be written into the ordinance," they being the new council people. "They would like for the audit firm not to be connected to any Anderson County employee and make sure there was a divorce between that or any kind of special interest. That the administrator and financial director would be placed on paid leave. They would be readily available to answer any questions that they in that case would be the financial director. They would be readily available to answer any questions that should become necessary, and they would be prohibited from having contact during this audit period." And then it proceeds to talk about the acting administrator. The question I have is, do you deny that the acting administrator concept was discussed prior to August 5th of 2008 as reflected by this transcript?
I can't deny that, but I can't recall it either. if the verbiage may have been used at some point. Like I say, this was the first time that I've seen anything to this detail. And if that verbiage had been used at some point earlier, it could have been thrown out about an acting administrator. But I can't recall specifically.
Do you recall anyone disagreeing with any of Mr. Waldrop's concepts about an audit and or an acting administrator?
No.
Does that include Mr. Dunn?
I don't recall him.
Mr. Dunn never disagreed with him, did he?
No, not to my knowledge.
Did Mr. Moore ever disagree with him?
No.
Did Ms. Wilson ever disagree with him?
No.
Did they all appear to agree with him about these issues?
Yes. Like I say, yeah, nobody objected to it. So as I said, the three of us were the brand new folks coming on there, and here's a guy that knew what he was doing.
Did anyone say, we disagree with that, we won't support that audit?
No, not to my knowledge.
Did anyone say, we disagree with that, we won't support the appointment of an acting administrator?
No.
During that time period where an acting administrator would be hired, what was your understanding that Mr. Preston would be doing?
My understanding, and I think that he would basically be kind of on paid vacation. In other words, not be in the office.
Would he be performing any of his duties as the county administrator?
Not according to the way this was set up or designed.
In that sense, was it your understanding that the county council would simply direct Mr. Preston to go on some sort of leave?
That was my understanding.
Mr. Allen, did you attend a victory party for Bob Waldrop in his election in 2008?
I did. Was that in July?
Yes, sir.
2008. I'm glad you're bringing this up. Yes, I did.
Where was it located?
That was at the Cobb's Glen Country Club.
Who was there?
Bunches of people. I can't recall all their names. A bunch of the Republican Party people were there.
Was Tommy Dunn there?
He didn't go to some of those. I can't remember if he was at that or not. I don't know. I can't remember if Tommy was there or not.
Was Brooks Brown there?
According to his notes, he was.
You don't recall him being...
I don't recall him being there, but he probably was. I don't recall, but he probably was because he gave his support to Bob Waldrop when he pulled out of the election. He gave his support to Bob, and he was, I'm pretty sure, at the victory party.
How long have you known Brooks Brown?
First time I met him was that I recall having a conversation with him was at a council meeting. Now, I'd been going to council meetings 2 years before I got elected, so I knew who Brooks Brown was. I don't know that I ever spoke to him, though, at any of those council meetings, prior to my election. So, I mean, it's conceivable we could have said hi in the aisle or something like that, before I was elected to the council. But I don't remember having any conversations with him.
Do you deny having told him that we have a way, and I quote, we have a way to get rid of Joey, end quote?
Absolutely. That is an out-and-out lie, which I will swear to on a stack of Bibles, his mother's grave and my mother's grave. And why he came up with a piece of garbage like that is beyond me. I would, one, never have said that. Number two, never have said anything like that. Number three, it sounds like a bad script out of a 5th grade comic book, and I was very close to filing a libel suit when that came up. However, I thought we've got enough lawsuits going on. It's going to be my word against his. It will drag out for another 2 or 3 years in court for what? But if it ever comes up again, I will likely have to change my attitude.
Do you have any specific recollection of speaking to Mr. Brown at any...
No, I don't.
How did the group anticipate Mr. Preston would respond